Last week I've talked about how I would rebalance the spear, the hunting bow and the katana. But there was one problem I deliberately not talked about. Because no matter how many changes you do to these weapons, they will never be properly balanced if the system beneath it stays as it is. And that system is stamina. In my opinion, stamina has quietly become one of Hunt Showdown's biggest design problems. Not because it's completely broken, but because it allows some of the strongest mechanics in Hunt Showdown to completely ignore the resource that is supposed to limit them. So today we're gonna talk about how I would completely redesign the stamina system of Hunt Showdown. But before we can fix the stamina system, we first need to understand how it actually works. And despite what many people think, Hunt Showdown doesn't just have one stamina system. It actually has three. The first one is sprint stamina. If you sprint for too long, your hunter becomes exhausted, your sprint speed slows down, your breathing becomes louder, and rotating across the map suddenly becomes much riskier. Its purpose is simple. It prevents people from running at full speed forever. The second system is the visible stamina bar. This is a resource used for melee attacks. Heavy swings, fighting AI, and many physical actions consume this stamina. And once it's empty, your hunter becomes less effective when it comes to melee attacks. And finally, there's the third stamina system most people don't know about. When you repeatedly jump or crouch, Hunt applies a movement penalty. It's essentially another form of stamina, even though the game never presents it that way. So in reality, Hunt Showdown doesn't just rely on one stamina system. It relies on three separate ones, each designed to solve a different problem. Sprint stamina limits endless movement, combat stamina limits repeated melee actions, and the hidden stamina system prevents people from abusing the movement system. On paper, this sounds like a very solid design, which raises a more interesting question. If each individual system makes sense, why does the overall system still feel so unsatisfying? Well, that's exactly the question I keep coming back to. Because the longer I look at Hunt Showdown's stamina system, the more I realize something. None of these mechanics are bad on their own. In fact, I'd argue that every single one of them exists for a good reason. And that's exactly where everything starts falling apart. Let's start with a simple example. Imagine your hunter has completely run out of combat stamina. According to the game, you're exhausted. You no longer have enough stamina to perform heavy melee attacks. That makes perfect sense. But then something strange happens. You can still throw a throwing spear with enough force to kill a player. So apparently your hunter is too exhausted to swing, but not exhausted enough to launch a heavy weapon across the room. That doesn't follow the same logic. And the spear isn't the only example here. Think about what exhaustion actually means. If you've pushed your body to its absolute limits, you would expect that to affect more than just one animation. Maybe your attacks become weaker, maybe you aim a little slower, or maybe your weapon handling gets much worse. Instead, Hunt Showdown treats exhaustion like an on-off switch. Certain actions stop working, while many others perform the exact same way they did before. The game tells you your hunter is exhausted, but it rarely makes you feel like your hunter is exhausted. And then the biggest contradiction of them all, the stamina shot. With a single consumable, sprint and combat stamina becomes completely irrelevant. One of the game's core design system can effectively be completely switched off for several minutes. Not reduced, not improved, completely bypassed. And that's where I think the real issue begins. The problem isn't that Hunt Showdown has too many stamina systems. The problem is that the game never feels consistent when stamina is supposed to actually matter. Sometimes it's the most important resource you can have, and sometimes it might as well not exist. And if the rules keep changing depending on the situation, balancing weapons around those rules basically becomes impossible. But how do you actually fix a system that doesn't even follow its own rules? Well, when I first started thinking about it, my first instinct was pretty simple. Why not combine everything into one stamina bar? At first, that honestly sounded like the perfect solution for me. One resource, one set of rules, and one system that controls every physical action. Sprinting, melee attacks, jumping, or crouching. It would immediately make the game feel more consistent. If your hunter is exhausted, then he is exhausted. Simple. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it would create a much bigger problem for the game. Because Hunt Showdown doesn't struggle with players being too aggressive. If anything, it struggles with the exact opposite. Camping, waiting, holding angles, and refusing to move. Now imagine every sprint toward a compound also drains the exact resource you need to fight. Suddenly, pushing becomes even riskier. Rotating becomes much more expensive. And the safest and best option often is to stay exactly where you are. And that is the last thing Hunt Showdown needs. The goal shouldn't be to punish movement. Movement is already one of the biggest risks you can take in Hunt Showdown. The goal should be to make combat decisions more meaningful. And those two are completely different things. Which means that I personally don't believe that the sprint stamina is the problem here. In fact, I even think that it serves its purpose pretty well. The real problem happens once combat enters the picture, because that's the system that constantly breaks its own rules. And that's also the system I would completely redesign. So what would that redesign actually look like? The first thing I'd change is simple. If your hunter is completely exhausted, powerful actions should become weaker. Not impossible to perform, but weaker. Take the throwing spear as example. Right now you can still throw to full force even if your stamina is empty. The same goes for the bow. Drawing back a bowstring requires physical effort. If you're exhausted, holding a bowstring at that position over longer periods of time should make you massively exhausted. And I would change that completely. If you're exhausted, you should still be able to throw the throwing spear, but not nearly as far and not nearly as fast. And certainly not with the same effectiveness. The same philosophy should apply to every physical action in the game too. Exhaustion shouldn't lock you out of specific systems. Instead, it should make your decision less effective. The same goes for aiming. If your hunter has completely exhausted himself in combat, your weapon shouldn't behave the same as it did before. Maybe aiming down sight takes longer. Maybe your weapon sway is increased for a brief moment. Not enough to make gunfights frustrating, but frustrating enough that exhausting yourself before a fight happens actually has consequences. Because that's what stamina is supposed to represent. Physical exhaustion, not an arbitrary restriction for a few actions. Every change should follow one simple rule. If an action requires physical effort, stamina should influence it. And if it doesn't, stamina shouldn't pretend it does. The goal is not to make Hunt Showdown slower, but instead make stamina matter again.
Yeah, cool, but I can just use a stamina shot and ignore literally everything you just said. Wait, isn't that the exact problem we had last week?
Ludwig is completely right. If the stamina shot stays exactly the way it is right now, almost everything I suggested becomes completely irrelevant. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk about stamina first before talking about weapon balance. Because the stamina shot doesn't improve the stamina system. It completely removes it. For several minutes, sprinting and combat stamina becomes completely irrelevant. Instead of interacting with one of Hunt's resource systems, you simply stop thinking about it altogether. And that's a completely different thing. Good consumables should make you feel stronger, but they shouldn't delete entire gameplay systems. Think about the regeneration shot as example. It doesn't make you immortal. It simply allows you to recover health over time. An antidote shot doesn't remove damage from the game. It simply protects you from a specific threat. The stamina shot, however, is completely different. It tells one of Hunt Showdown's core systems to simply stop existing. That's why I wouldn't remove it. I actually think that the idea behind the consumable is pretty good. I just think that it rewards the wrong thing. Instead of giving you unlimited stamina, I would turn the stamina shot into something similar like the regeneration shot. Your stamina would still drain like it usually does. Running still costs stamina, heavy attacks still cost stamina, and physical exhaustion would still exist. The difference is what happens afterwards. The moment you stop consuming stamina, it immediately starts regenerating. No delay. And it regenerates significantly faster than it usually does. Kind of like the Sun Tarot card when it comes to regeneration. You're still interacting with the stamina system. You're just simply recovering faster than everybody else. And by the way, if you enjoy short high-density analysis like this one, focused on why good game systems create interesting choices and where inconsistency completely destroys good game designs. That's exactly what this channel does. Subscribing makes sense. So after all of this, do I actually think that Hunt Showdown's stamina system is broken? No, I don't. In fact, I would even argue that the system behind it is actually very well thought out. The problem was never that these systems exist. The problem is that they don't follow the same philosophy. Sometimes stamina matters, sometimes it suddenly doesn't. And then one consumable comes along and completely disables the entire system. And if Crytek decides to revisit stamina in the future, I hope they don't ask themselves the question, how do I slow the players down? And instead hope they ask themselves, how do we make stamina create more interesting decisions?